Welcome back to the Female Dating Strategy, the meanest female only dating podcast on the internet. I'm your new host, Diana.
And I'm Rose. And today, Diana, what are we discussing?
We are going to talk about the notorious 4B movement.
Notorious. I love that.
hmm
Why is it so notorious?
Well, anytime women start to make sense, men immediately get all riled up about it and make it notorious. So, anytime we start making too much sense, it automatically becomes notorious.
Touche, touche. This is so true. And the 4B movement, I don't know about you, but I only started to hear about it online, I would say, when I joined Reddit back in 2020 during the COVID lockdown. That's when I started to I heard little peeks of it because a lot of the female only subreddits that got banned, like pink pilled, black pilled, there were a whole bunch that existed back then that were very active, that were much more aligned with radical feminism. And of course, they all got brigaded and then subsequently banned. So they preceded FDS in that sense. But that was the first time I started to hear whispers of what 4B was. And if I may, could I just provide a brief overview of what that is before we go into it?
Of course.
Okay. One thing we did want to offer our listeners was a disclaimer. Could you go over our disclaimer for today, Diana?
Yes. Well, we understand that this particular movement has such a vast global impact. And while we want to make sure that we do it justice and that we try to cover as much ground on how it's impacted the world, it's not actually possible for us to go into detail about every single continent. So we just want listeners to be mindful of the fact that we are going to try our best to do due diligence and to give you as much information and insight as we can possibly do without, going on tangents a little too much or or even just leaving you with the impression that we're just trying to skip through incredibly important discussions about minority groups because we want to make sure that, this is a movement that really started out of Asia, out of Korea specifically, and it came out of issues that were affecting the Korean peninsula for a really long time. This is just a culmination of a lot of efforts of women online to galvanize and organize themselves in ways that we have yet to see other women around the world galvanize themselves in that way to do that. So we just want to make sure that we did that, give them due credit, but also we want people to understand that it's not possible for us to go into so much detail about every single minority group. And so we're going to do our best to make sure that, when you leave this episode, you're leaving with somewhat of a broader understanding of what this movement is and why it's so impactful and why it's changing the game, really.
Wonderfully said. And that's the point is that, there's so much nuance to this discussion. And of course, a 1 hour podcast can only convey so much information, also without just being simply didactic and dry as hell, which is something we want to avoid. And in fact, something we'd really welcome from our listeners and our feedback is where are you letting us know how things are coming from where you're from. So for example, last week, Diana and I were wondering, do we have any listeners from South America? Do we have any listeners from Mexico? What about Eastern Europe? How about Sub-Saharan Africa? We simply don't know what's going on the ground all over the world. How could we? But I think the more we are talking amongst one another, as we are seeing with this 4B movement's impact, the more we are becoming aligned and starting to act as a collective, like as a gender collective. And that I think is the direction we have to go in to have a brighter future. So with all that being said, I'm just going to give a brief overview of what I know about 4B, and then we're going to go into it. Are you ready, Diana?
Sounds good.
Let's go. So from what I understand, and again, this is coming out of South Korea. I live in the Midwest of the United States. So there's only so much information that I have. And if I'm incorrect about something or if I'm incomplete, I really would invite our listeners to correct me and let me know what's what. But from my understanding, what really kicked this off was a 2016 novel by Cho Nam-jus. I also want to apologize for any of my mispronunciations, but I do think it's important that we try to pronounce words in their own native language and that we not just completely leave other languages off of the table just because the speaker is worried about mispronouncing. So this novel was called Kim Ji-young, born 1982. And it's basically a never-ending compendium of just every woman's daily experience of all the sexism, all of the inequality, and all of the misogyny in South Korea. And this book led to an avalanche of online chatter and discourse amongst South Korean feminists. It also started to intersect. It was at that time that Me Too was really starting to kick off in the West. And there were also various sub movements kicking off in South Korea, one that included an Escape the Corset campaign, where they were pushing back against these unattainable standards of beauty and gendered presentation. The 4B is based off of the 4Bs in South Korea: Bihon, which is no to heterosexual marriage; Bichulsan, which is no to childbirth; Biyone, no to dating; and Bisexu, no to heterosexual sexual relationships. And this has come about after, millennia of South Korean women have gone through. I mean, if we even look at some of the modern wars they've gone through, the Korean War, World War II, and Japan's exploitation of them, and especially now with digital crime, underskirt photographs, etc., stalking, all of this has led to an absolutely insupportable situation for South Korean women. And if you look at some of the data out of the World Economic Forum's 2022 Global Gender Gap Index, South Korea is ranked at 99 out of 146 countries for gender equality. Furthermore, a January 2023 article in the South Korean newspaper, the Sisa Times, reported that 65% of women in the country do not want children, 42% do not want to get married, and that is due to over 80% of those women citing domestic violence as the key reason for why they do not want to get married. And so this is a long overdue movement coming from our Asian sisters, who I think have really led the way in thinking about sort of tactical strikes and different sorts of strategies that are needed in order to force a global sea change or even just a regional one on the dating market. That's about my summation of 4B, Diana. So let's get into it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was actually great. And yes, it does cover so much ground. I grew up with many Korean people and I've, worked in Korea. And so I have a somewhat cursory sort of understanding of just how life is out there. I mean, if I could share like a personal sort of story, it's not my personal story, but it's a story that a friend of mine told me. So one of my friends was a teacher. Like it's very common for Americans to go and teach English in Korea. It's like one of the countries besides, Japan and China where there just tend to be a lot of American expats. And so she was one of those teachers, who taught in a Korean hagwon. So a hagwon is essentially a cram school. It's like after they go to school and they check out for the day, then they go to like another cram school and they continue to study. So she was a teacher in the hagwon, and she told me a really jarring story of how she was on her way to one of her lessons and she stopped by a classroom and there was a male teacher there with a whole bunch of male students and they were watching upskirt videos in the classroom. And it was like extremely shocking, obviously, for her because, this would never fly in the States. And, she was like in two minds about like having to report it, obviously, but in the end, she ended up reporting it to the homeroom teacher or not the homeroom teacher, the head of the Hagwon or whatever. And nothing was done. The man wasn't fired. They kind of just like brushed it aside because they thought if she was just like a foreigner causing trouble. But like, around the time I went there was like before COVID. So, you could already kind of see like the fledgling, the beginnings of like 4B. At the same time, it was kind of considered a fringe movement. Like people, felt the inequality deeply. And especially women had a lot to say about it. Like I spoke to a lot of Korean women who kind of acknowledged, their own hardship, but at that time, it was still somewhat of like a hush hush online fringe kind of movement. But the pain that they were feeling was extremely real. They were worried about going to public bathrooms because of molka. And molka is essentially the public camera crime, like, where men put cameras into public bathrooms as a way to like video women who are going and using the restrooms. And, we're at a stage now where we have to have these discussions all over again about restrooms, right? Like we could probably do a whole episode just on like, sex based rights, but like a lot of them were talking about the violation and just like the way that the sexes were organized in Korea and how difficult it was to have sincere sort of connections with men because of the way that society was structured. And like Korea is a very hierarchy based culture. They have a lot of respect for their elders. You address people with honorifics. You speak to people a certain way depending on their age and gender and rank too. So they already have this inbuilt system where it's very difficult to stand up to authority. And the women who work in these workforces, they are subjected to a lot of harassment when they're working, which they can't turn away. And a lot of them turn to marriage and husbands as a way to have like a male figure around, so that like their bosses don't exact labor from them and don't force them to do things they don't want to do. I remember a friend of mine said once, like, they have this tradition called hueshik, and it's very similar in Japan as well. Hueshik is essentially like after you're done working, you go out for drinks with your boss and you can't turn it down, because if you turn it down, it's seen as like disrespectful and like you're not serious about your career. So she would go for these hueshiks even though she didn't really drink, but you can't turn down a drink from your boss. So she would have to drink more than she wanted. And she was like, sometimes it's so strict, like depending on what kind of company you work for, you can't, like, say that you hate pork. You can't turn down pork if that's what your boss orders. So you have to eat things and do things you don't want to do. And it's considered like worth your time because you want to succeed at your job and advance in your position. And often women are prevented from holding positions of power because of, the idea that they'll get married and have children and they're just going to leave the workforce anyway. So why bother investing in them? So you could kind of see that this was like, the milk boiling in the pot and it was about 5 seconds away from boiling all the way over. And so it was like teetering at that point for like a really long time. And so there's all of these like structural sort of inequities in Korea that make it very difficult for women to have a public voice. And feminism in Korea is like very much at the stage of like, it's a bad, dirty word. I remember that there was a K pop idol who was reading Kim Ji Young, born 1982. I don't remember exactly which K pop idol it was, but she had like a picture of it on her Instagram or something. It went viral and everybody like latched onto it, and she was bullied in the media for reading that book, for just reading it, which is crazy because the band BTS, their leader, Rap Monster, he was reading the book as well. And people were praising him and being like, oh, he's such a feminist. He's such a good guy. So it was so frustrating that like there was this male idol who was reading this book and everyone is praising him for reading this book. But at the same time, his contemporary was being like essentially bullied by the netizens for reading this book. So like the online culture of the place is also extremely hostile. I mean, there's definitely a lot I can add about just, life in Korea and, insights from the people I grew up with and just my own personal sort of experiences there as well. But I mean, just to, condense like a broader point, shit was pretty bad there like 5 years ago. You know what I mean? And I mean, it's probably been bad for a while because Japan's occupation of Korea and the subsequent, US military occupation of Korea, because they're technically in like a weird proxy war with Russia, between the Koreas, resulted in, the women being extremely exploited. And I see this as like a long time coming, essentially, for the Korean women, for just standing up and saying, hey, we've had enough. We've had enough of being shit on by everyone. And this is our way of reclaiming our power. And instead of participating in these systems that keep them oppressed, they're standing up and saying, we've had enough and no more. You do not get to do this to us. And so, kudos to those Korean women.
Kudos, all the flowers. That's what I was going to say, Diana. And thank you. Honestly, I really appreciate hearing these personal anecdotes because I think a lot of times online, a lot of these women have to be as circumspect and cautious as possible. And so a lot of personal details are never shared because they don't want to be doxxed. And I think that's a correct assumption on their part. But so that means a lot of the personal shades of stories gets erased. And so hearing this story of yours, I mean, it's just infuriating. It is just maddening that this violation of women, upskirts or going to the bathroom is just entertainment for a school teacher and the schoolboys. That is just casually a diversion for them, a pastime, seeing women and exploiting them and at their most vulnerable, finding pleasure and finding joy in violating them in that manner. And so when I hear about this, I just want to say to the South Korean sisters, thank you so much. I cannot thank you enough for how you have pinpointed and strategized in a way that is kneecapping these men and your society. It is such an inspiration. I am so impressed. And I'm just going to keep listening to you and doing our part here in the Northern Hemisphere because when I see what's already happening in this short amount of time from this 4B movement, how can you not help but be impressed? I mean, I think, didn't I just read that who is the current prime minister of South Korea? Wasn't he threatening to erase or disband the Department of Equality? But if I'm not mistaken, he was elected. One of his platform's promises was that he would put women back where they belong. And of course, South Korean men overwhelmingly elected him because if this isn't the promise that they want to see paid good, I don't know what is.
Yeah, his name is President Yoon Suk Yeol. He's the president, and he decided to abolish the Ministry of Gender Equality.
Okay, the Ministry of Gender Equality. I mean, if this isn't some Orwellian shit, I don't know what is. But again, I still remember being struck like, oh, this is his platform that he's running on, and it's what gets him elected. I mean, if that doesn't go to show you like the extreme rancor that these men have towards women, that they actually want to abolish the one ministry dedicated to them, which they've had for what, maybe a couple decades? It's just mind blowing.
I just want to add another point about why Yoon Suk Yeol was so popular. One of the reasons I think also why, like as I mentioned earlier, Korea happens to be a very hierarchy oriented culture. And like the way that we have like nepo babies, they have these people called chaebols, and they're essentially like the kids of large conglomerates and corporations. So almost everyone else has to like, eat dirt and essentially work their way up from somewhere. But these guys just have life handed out to them. And so there was like this division essentially between the classes of like people who get to move through the system with ease and people who have to work extremely hard at it. And part of the reason why he spoke to the Korean male population specifically was because a lot of Korean men believed at their hearts that women had it easier because of the military service. So Korea conscribes its men into, I think it depends which part of the military you're in, but like a 21-month-ish military service. And that takes away their ability to earn money and provide for their families and all this other stuff. So they already feel like they're at a disadvantage because they have to like essentially quit school or get out in the prime of their careers to go and do this military service because there's always this threat of invasion from North Korea. And so he kind of spoke to them in a way that alleviate, like as all despots and dictators do, he kind of spoke to them in a way that made them comfortable and kind of coddled their fears and was like, you provide such an essential service to our country by essentially being willing to die for us in the military. The women don't do that. They don't conscribe. So when we're doing our part of serving in the military, why don't these bitches just shut the fuck up and give us our kids? Essentially, that was what his argument boiled down to, is that women don't really have to struggle. So why aren't they just accepting their position and the fact that they need to get married and have babies? Like, why are they making this so hard? We all have to do things we don't want to do. So, that was the way his argument was presented. And as you can possibly imagine, the Korean men really took it and ran with it. So, his appeal doesn't just come from the fact that he's peddling the basest ideas of misogyny. It's the fact that there are real structural issues in Korea with the way that its economy is being run and the way that its colonization and the post military industrial complex, the US military industrial complex, has affected the nation. And so the division of labor and the division of gender there is just in a position where it's just not sustainable, and also everyone there has to work extremely hard. They are, extremely overworked people as a population. They spend all their lives in school, and then after school, they spend all this time in hagwons, and then they have to make sure they have extremely good grades, and that's what sets them up for like a good life. And like it depends on whether they go to like a really good university, but like their entire life is dictated by these very few choices they make when they're extremely young. And so I think a lot of them have this impression that like, hey, I do all of this work. I served in the military. Like, why am I not being handed my life on a platter? Because for a very long time, that was the norm.
Well, and women are the scapegoat, women are the scapegoat, and women are the reward.
Exactly. And so they see their position in society as, hey, I'm doing something I really don't want to do with the promise that I'm going to be rewarded with a wife and a child, and at least a way for me to take out my frustrations from capitalism, essentially, because after they come back from the military, they still have to work like dogs. You know what I mean? So they want this buffer, this place where they can vent their frustrations. And if women choose to not participate, then that's gone.
Well, and I think that's another one of the stats that most struck me was that 80% of women were avoiding marriage because of domestic violence. So, what are the rates of domestic violence? Do we even know? If anything, if it's 80% is what's acknowledged, I would dare to say that it's got to be upwards of 90%, where women are just considered, the punching bag for the frustrations of these men who will never reach the heights that they hope to attain. And especially when we think about between K pop and K movies, K film, the glamorized, sanitized version of South Korea that we see, is this like world of glamour and ease and luxury and abundance. But like you say, If that's what's being presented to its people, and yet they have to work like a dog, where that disconnect has to be something that is so psychologically disturbing for so many, particularly if you've been raised as a male in this hierarchy and have been told that these are the wages that you receive if you play the game right. And women are simply saying, we're no longer playing this game.
Yep. The other aspect of it is also, with this Hallyu wave, like the Korean wave of content that's now become like a global sort of phenomena. The broader issue is that, first of all, let's take K dramas, okay, just as an isolated example. K dramas are by and large written for Korean women by Korean women. Maybe the decision makers at the producers level are men, but for the most part, a good significant population of those K drama writers are women. It tends to be the Korean movies that are more male dominated, the feature films, as we call them. And so that's why the feature films have such a tonal shift from what you usually see in dramas. I feel like dramas have like a variety. You got love stories, you got family dramas, you sometimes have crime. But the film scene is a little bit more, what you'd call like indie sort of cinema that goes to like Cannes and shit. It's like, it's meant to be art house. It's not really meant to be like candy floss that's consumed by the masses. And so for a very long time, I mean, Korean dramas and Korean music was always really popular in Asia. Let me just stress that. It's America that caught on to it super late. And the reason why Americans caught on to it at all was because of their diaspora, like the Korean people and like the Asian diaspora that brought it along with them. So by the time Korean music and dramas blew up in the States, which was like maybe shortly before COVID and, maybe like I'd say the mid 2010s, it already had like a significant impact in Asia specifically, especially Southeast and East Asia. I don't even think really South Asia cottoned on to it so much. Like at the time when I was watching K dramas, which was like in the early 2000s, I was one of maybe maybe 100 people in my country that were watching it. That's only because I had Korean friends and roommates who exposed me to it. So, very specific context. But the movies, when you watch the Korean dramas specifically, it's quite telling that the romantic ones, they're very specifically focused on selling you an ideal of masculinity that does not exist. And even Korean women acknowledge that. Even Korean men acknowledge that. They find it to be a very unrealistic fantasy. You have like 10 episodes where people are being very chaste and holding hands and like kissing and stuff, but the reality of actually dating Korean men, and this is why I really want to stress to like all the Korea boos out there who watch, Korean dramas and think you're going to go to Korea and find like an oppa and just have like a great life. That's not going to be your life, okay? There's some serious structural problems in that country, like any other country, and the men are just as capable of being misogynistic. And if you don't take my word for it, ask Korean women yourself. But they sell an idealized fiction because the vast majority of the early K drama watchers were stay at home moms, essentially, people who weren't in the workforce. So their whole thing was about trying to appeal to that population. And that's why I think it has such a huge female fan base is it caters to a fantasy that's not really real. But then when you actually deconstruct some of the more problematic elements of these dramas, you see that they have a lot of really problematic things like, the woman pretending to be drunk so that the guy like will kiss her when she's drunk because she can't actually be sexually open and like herself kiss him herself, or the guy like manhandling her and like dragging. This is like such a trope in Korean dramas where he just like drags her across the street and like holds her hand and doesn't let go and just like drags her around like she's a rag doll. And people treated it like it's like super romantic, and it's really not. The only thing that they really do hint at all is like the class divide, because it's always like some chaebol guy. It's like some guy who's like extremely wealthy and comes from generational wealth, and like some extremely poor woman who's not going to be allowed to date him or marry him because his mom is like totally against it, and how she like wins over his heart and he fights for their relationship. But again, this is all fiction. It's all fantasy. And Korean women have warned other people about the fact that this is fiction, and the reality of being a Korean woman, a reality of being a Korean girlfriend or Korean wife is not that.
I appreciate so much this overview, Diana, because it's so true. Like the US is absolutely like last of all the globe in coming to appreciate the cultural capital from South Korea. But one thing I want to note too is it's not just South Korean women that are telling us this. Online, I've been seeing more and more, whether it's Stitches or TikTok or YouTube individuals, they are coming forward, especially the younger women, younger Black women who have wanted to go to South Korea for educational exchange, or other blonde white American women who go to teach English for a couple of years. And they all come back with these stories of just how horrifying the daily newspaper is as far as reports of murder and violence against women. and also about the gap in inequality in respect and how women are treated and the hypocrisy of how American women are treated there, especially ones who go with these like heart-shaped eyes and the fantasy of the K-drama hero being their future husband. And so if we're not listening, it's on us to not have been listening because they have been shouting it from the rooftops increasingly over the last couple of years. And again, I really want to point out how social media has really allowed this discourse to flourish because I think simply North American feminists weren't listening. And even to this day, they still don't listen to many other women, especially if you're a Black woman, if you're an Indigenous woman. If you're anyone who doesn't look the same as they do, they're less inclined to listen to you. And this is an ongoing problem that radical feminists, I think, are learning to grapple with. But all I can say is I've been so excited to see 4B trickling down into North American feminist circles. I know you tend to travel and live around various countries and regions, Diana. What have you been seeing in the news or in social media in women's circles?
So, as far as the Asian impact is concerned, I think that 4B did trickle down to China and, I mean, to a certain extent, Japan as well. Japan has like a huge incel problem. They call them hikikomoris, but they're essentially incels. And they're basically men who are like, what was the episode? The NEAT episode, the never employed, educated people, the train wrecks who like mooch off of their parents. Like, there's a total brand for that in Japan. They're called hikikomoris, and they're just these guys who don't work and like haven't been to school, and they don't even leave their house. They're like shut-ins essentially. And Japanese women have also been talking about the kind of burden of like having to, like, how to navigate their careers, because if they get married or they choose to have kids and stuff, it's a complete derailment of their professional ambitions. And again, even in Japan, they have a very similar problem to Korea in that there's not a lot of women who are represented in politics or in business or in any place really where there's massive power. Japan is also an incredibly expensive place to have a family. And the government's band aid solutions for trying to encourage people to procreate has not been effective, because you can't just have economic incentives to try to get people to play ball, essentially.
To take on the burden.
Yeah. And as well, China tacked on two more things to the 4B movement. I think it was one was like, don't wear makeup and participate in the beauty industry, which I thought was a pretty good one. And another one, let me see if I can find it. Just give me a second.
While you're looking that up, one thing I'm thinking about is how, with the rise of cost of living and sort of the uncertainty of markets, women and financial freedom, women and money, it is the one guarantee for women in order to be able to free themselves from violence or from a degenerate husband. And I think that in particular is why many of these governments aren't interested in helping equalize the job markets, because they know that if they can give men the prize, the conciliation prize of a woman who's dependent on them, the men are never going to turn their eyes to the true evil behind the empire, which is the government, right? Which is very happy to leave the majority of its population lagging behind in a time of never before seen abundance. And there was a quote I had read just yesterday. It was talking about women and money. And she's like, I don't know why he's so opposed to me working. And somebody had said, if he can't feed you, he can't starve you.
Yep. So I have the other two. So they have a movement called 6B4T, and it has all the four that the South Korean 4B movement has, but it also has not buying sexist products and supporting fellow single women practicing the movement. And the 4T refers to rejecting strict beauty standards, hypersexual depictions of women in Japanese otaku culture, which is like the anime, manga kind of culture, religion, and idol culture. So they're basically eschewing idol culture, which again, South Korea and even Japan have a huge investment in K-pop and like idols in general, because it's a huge driver to their economy now, and it's a huge driver of tourism, which is a major factor of their, it's a major player now in their economy. A lot of women are going to Korea in, with like romantic stars in their eyes, essentially, and it's a direct result of this K-pop industry. So they're basically saying that we reject idol culture, especially for women. The female idol culture is extremely misogynistic. It's basically to cater to these extremely creepy men. But the thing with China was that the women who were doing this in secret, online, were being hunted down by the government, essentially, because the Chinese government does not play like that. They are extremely anti feminism.
Of course they are.
I mean, unlike Korea, which is still a democracy, they have total power to, like, squash and silence women and throw them in prison. So China and Iran are very similar in that their government has basically straight up started a digital war against its women. Shout out to Chinese and Iranian women, because I mean, we're all struggling with these issues, but to be directly demonized by your government and being able to be sent to prison for having any kind of feminist ideal, those are the real heroes, because they're doing it at great personal risk to their lives. It's not just a matter of holding a personal belief, it's a matter of living that ideal, and the government is more than willing to silence them and throw them in prison for having those beliefs. So there are still parts of the world where being a feminist or being an open feminist is like, it sets legal precedent for politicians to send you to prison.
You know what scares me is that I don't think we're that far off from it at any moment here in the West. I mean, we were discussing this before we started the program, but one thing we were talking about was this increase of discourse, especially in the US, around abortion, around reproductive freedoms, even around no fault divorce. These are different areas in which our governments, people elected by the people, are working to roll back all of the gains, any of the few gains that women have achieved here in the United States. And keep in mind, a lot of this is going to be based around finance and making sure women are as limited as possible, as constricted as possible in having financial freedom, because that is the fulcrum upon which everybody moves. So, again, as you say, to our women sisters in Iran and China, we salute you. I always wonder if do they even have access to these kinds of podcasts? I can't imagine they do. So at this point, what can we pivot to as far as what kind of lessons we take from it and how we can apply it to female dating strategy?
This part is, I guess, a little bit harder. Well, we should, set the record straight. 4B is a separatist movement. And so that's one of the ways it's kind of different from FDS, because FDS is specifically a strategy to help women find healthy partnerships. So, our approach is completely different in that we are maybe not encouraging of women settling for garbage, but we do have this thing at our very heart, which is that we want women to be strategic about finding a partner, right? Whereas 4B is very clear in its mission statement, which is that completely separate from men. So to me, that comes down to personal choice, right? Not to play into choice feminism specifically, but I mean, if you are a woman who feels like you are happy with your life and you are content with the finances you're making, you live in a free and liberal society. I mean, I'm jealous of you. I'd like to join that. But if you're in a position where you're earning money, you have a set life, you have good friends, and you don't feel like there's anything missing, and you feel like this is something that appeals to you, then by all means, if you want to embody these values, I mean, I feel like I've done this just by accident. You know what I mean? It wasn't even really a conscious thing. It's just like it made sense to me, because obviously I would separate if I feel like the existing population isn't suitable for my needs, right? But we are going with a slightly more optimistic tone in that we presume that there are a few people that are actually worth the time. And so our approach is by definition a little bit different, because we're trying to basically set you up with the best framework for navigating an already very tricky dating environment. So we're going in with the assumption that there are some people who are out there that are worth it. And this is the strategy to find those people. Now, we can't guarantee or, place a number down on exactly how many decent people there are out there, because obviously we don't know. But I would argue and probably assume that it is a very small number. So if you feel like it's worth it for you, then that's what you should be doing. But, I mean, I'm not here to really lecture women on what they feel is an acceptable way of living their life. I completely understand where these women are coming from, especially as far as like rejecting idol culture, rejecting beauty standards, because they come from cultures that are extremely, in some ways, superficial when it comes to what a woman's role is in society. And I think that they're navigating a new historical period in their countries where they're trying to navigate what is their role as women in their own society. So we can't like wholesale take all of their ideas and apply it to our own, because we're talking about two completely different contexts and two cultures with completely different histories in terms of women's rights. So I wouldn't advise an American woman who grew up with like the traditional American waves of feminism to look at South Korea and be like, I need to adopt this wholesale, because their movement has really come from a historical context, you know? It's come from a rejection of these historical norms that have been set on them that they don't agree with. And so if you have to find your version of 4B, whatever that is, if you feel like it's the right choice to eschew relationships with men, not date them, not, I mean, FDS is pretty clear about, like, we don't really believe that men and women can really be friends. Maybe allies, in a strange way. Like, maybe you have mutually aligned goals, but not friends in the sense that you can wholly trust them.
And this is where I think there's almost a clear through line, or if you want to say a spectrum. I feel like FDS is at if we want to look at like somewhat integrated to a non integrated perspective on how a woman can live her life, I think we have to go with FDS is the safest way to approach dating and heterosexual relationships if you want to pursue that. Do not allow any of your standards to go lower than that. If you do want to engage, these are the parameters by which we're trying to engage. From there, you can sort of slide on down to the non integrated side that 4B represents. And this is something that I've been seeing a lot of. Again, I love to go onto YouTube. I don't know about you, Diana. I'm not on like Instagram or TikTok or whatnot, but a lot of TikTok stitches are put on YouTube feminist channels, and then they discuss this with their listeners. And I'm just seeing countless stitches of women talking about 4B here in the West, and a lot of men responding with vitriol and with derision and American women will never make this happen. Well, of course, because like you say, there's a specific historical context for it. But I think the fact that there is finally a blueprint that women can reference that shows you have more options than just marriage or boyfriend. These are not your only options in the world. And as a matter of fact, I would argue that FDS is also, like you say, we're talking about what you can do if you want to find and pursue that sort of relationship. That, like you say, already no to heterosexual relationships. I mean, we don't believe in friendships with men. We don't feel that women and men can be friends. We always support women finding other women as friends. Childbirth and marriage. These are things that we always talk about as only after extensive vetting and the most extreme circumspection with picking out your partner. To even marry them is one stage, to have children with them is another. And so again, I feel like these are steps that are being laid out for us to really see and understand the impact they have on society, as opposed to just going along with what's been modeled for us and sort of just swallowing, the Kool-Aid.
Yep. Again, you can't compare Korea with the US, because the US is kind of similar to China and India in that it's a vast and huge country with people who have very differing ideas and outlooks on life. They don't have the same kind of cultural standard or the homogeneity that Korea has. Korea had a generation of people who made a sacrifice in order to leave the kind of life they had in the 90s, which was, more like a third world country in Asia, to now being a global superpower. And that took a whole generation sacrifice to do it. So those women are willing to put the legwork in. And that is, something we should applaud them for. But it's also achievable because they're a smaller country. Like, it's kind of like a union, right? You have a smaller union, you can bargain because your country relies on this small union in order to produce the next generation's workers. But the US, Canada, and India don't have that option. They have a very divided class. They have a very divided caste, if you consider caste to be a category in America because of race. And, they have all of these other demographics that kind of prevent people from allying against, like, to all come together to fight for a singular ideal. It was easier when society was simpler, like 50, 60 years ago, but we are not in those times anymore. And I mean, if anything, the two-party system in the US has kind of shown that, because people don't want to have these two choices, but they've been forced to make a decision between two choices. And so it's not easy to measure American feminism to Korean feminism because they just have a completely different trajectory. And I think that the fact that the men are basically raging against 4B is a sign that they're doing something right, because men only get super riled up and all sensitive when they feel like there's something to lose. And I feel like they can sense that this is dangerous territory, because if suddenly all American women, the Republican women, the Democratic women, the undecideds, if they all got together and they decided to follow the 4B movement, that would spell the end of an era in America for American men.
Oh God, from your lips.
And they're well aware of that. They know that.
Absolutely. They're more acutely aware of that than even we women, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it was Andrea Dworkin, right, who said that, the thing is that right-wing men and left-wing men are no different. Right-wing men believe that women are private property, and left-wing men believe that women are public property. Either way, they both believe that women are property.
Andrea Dworkin, may you be resting in peace, eternal slumber. Uh, yes, absolutely. And I think this is why I am latching onto it with such vigor, Diana, is that regardless of whether the historical circumstances, the social context, the caste system, it's still such a powerful ideal. And let us not discount the power of ideas in galvanizing movements. This was something that we talked about how, for example, even in Black Lives Matter movement, a movement begun by a Black woman, I think Tarana Burke, right? And how quickly they were hidden and elided from the actual movement because Lord knows most American people don't want to hear from a Black woman, although they tend to be the ones who save us again and again. And it's the fact that this, especially historically, has been such a subjugated minority within this country because I think similar to Korean women, they're sort of stuck between this caste system and also the idea of sacrificing for the good of their people, right? And bringing the next generation, not allowing themselves to be further subordinated by the ruling class and eschewing childbirth and marriage. But it's between a rock and a hard place for them. And so, again, like you say, and for Indigenous women especially, I mean, there are so many subdivisions amongst the populations that it further keeps us fragmented, right? It keeps us siloed, it keeps us atomized so that we're not able to sort of form a collective movement.
Yes. And I mean, to be specific, attempts to form a collective movement have happened before. But I think that, like there's two parts of it, especially when you're a woman of color. I don't want to speak for all women of color, but I certainly think that this is relevant to my group. Is that, first of all, we feel a certain sense of loyalty to our men, misplaced sense of loyalty, if you ask me. But it's that historically, if you come from a colonized nation or, you come from a country where your people have suffered extreme violence at the hands of white people, as a woman, you're less likely to trust them, but you're also less likely to trust the women because traditionally white women have held their privilege like a weapon to wield against other women. And so it's been very difficult to form solidarity with them because often when we do form solidarity with them, they become the face of the movement. And so their problems become the majority's problems and their issues become the majority's issues. And so everything becomes about trying to rescue white womanhood and rescue white women specifically from their problems. And so all these other minority problems are kind of swept under the rug and then they continue. So I don't blame a lot of other minority women for being like the only way we're going to have these problems addressed in our communities, the violence that our men inflict on us, is if we go separate and we do it ourselves. But I think that there is power in numbers, and I think that again, when you're walking down a street, you are more likely to fear men from your own background than you are to fear any other woman on the street. And that itself is telling you instinctually that there is some value in trusting other women. Yes, I think that we probably should. I mean, just as I would advise women to vet the men in their lives that they choose to date, they should vet the women in their lives that they choose to befriend as well. And this goes back to like our other podcast that we're talking about female friendships.
I was just going to say, throwback to last week's podcast.
Exactly. So, it goes back to you don't have to get along with every woman on earth. You know what I mean? I know that we joke about like I support women's rights and I support women's wrongs, but if a woman is wronging you,
I have never heard that before. Oh my God, I want to make a t-shirt. That's amazing.
I say that all the time. I say I support women's rights and I support their wrongs as well,
You know what? I feel like this is the feminist version of equal rights, equal lefts.
Yeah.
Where men will say, well, if women want to be equal, that means we can beat you up. But no, that's not what it means. But this is like feminist answer to that. Ah.
Yeah, that's what I say. I support women's rights and I support their wrongs too. But I totally understand that you don't want to support a woman who is wronging you. And that's where you have to have discernment. And that's where we have to bring in nuance. Because the truth is that there is a breach of trust between people who come from a colonizer tradition, who have historically ruled over and had dominion over the global South, or people in their own lands like Canada, the US, even to the UK to a certain extent. Because what the English have done to their neighbors, to like Ireland and Wales and Scotland. They tested them out as guinea pigs and then moved on to the rest of the world. So we have a lot of distrust of people who don't come from our backgrounds in general. But when I started interacting with other Asian women who didn't come from cultures like my own, I found that even though their men like were different in their misogyny, we had very similar problems.
And that's the crux of it. That is the crux of it, is it not? Globally, whatever your global ethnicity, your religion, your class, your caste, we are more aligned as women than we will ever be with our male counterparts.
Yep, and we have the capacity to hear each other out now. There was a time in society when, before the internet, you had no way of knowing what the struggles were of women who were outside your hometown, let alone another country? And now we know what everyone is going through. We know what Iranian women are going through. We know what Chinese and Korean women are going through. We know what American women are going through. We have a window into other people's lives in a way that we've never had. And we should be responsible with that privilege. And we need to be constructive, and we need to think about, how exactly am I helping this person? I think a lot of us think, okay, I have a stronger voice, it's my job to like come out and speak out on the behalf of other people. But we have to kind of be careful about when we take on that savior role, because I think that at our hearts women feel this need to protect other people. If anything, we're the real protectors and providers. And so we feel like we want to speak for the people who are downtrodden, but we have to be extremely careful about putting on that savior's hat. When we're coming at it from a position of allyship and solidarity, we have to understand the context in which people are struggling and just lend them support in the way that they want. That's really the important key here, is it's not the way you want it. You don't know the entire total history of any real region. The best you can do is listen and offer support. We have to approach it from a position of being friends. The real driver of what's going to change things around is if we form these friendships with other women. Romance is actually not going to save us. What is going to save us at our very hearts is friendship with other women.
Preach, Diana, preach. This has been my motto for my entire life. And there's been a lot of heartbreak from a lot of the friendships that I've had because, as we know, our training historically has led us to be pitted against one another, to view friendship or life on this earth as a woman is a zero sum game. There is a winner and there is a loser. And that is actually what I think is at the heart of inhibiting us moving forward and collectivizing as a gender, is understanding that there is a lot of history there. There is a lot of oppression and exploitation at heart, but that doesn't mean we can't change the needle and move forward on a different path, on a better path. I get really hopeful and really excited when I hear the conversations happening in this day and age, conversations that weren't even happening 3 years ago or 5 years ago. So these windows that we're being granted is ultimate privilege. I mean, could you imagine even 100 years ago hearing from women in South Korea if you were in the UK or in New York? It simply wouldn't happen. And here we are having it transmitted in real time. As you say, learning how to listen and learning how to ally in the most meaningful way to those who are asking for help in ways that are specific to them, that is the way that we move forward. That is the way in which we lay the foundations for friendships that will lead to global changes. And I think at the heart of it, that's what we want, is it not? We want to see the globe move in a healthier direction, in a direction that's more woman oriented. And I think FDS, we're doing our part.
Yep. And I think, we want the exact same things from our partners as well, right? I think we need to start leading by example, because the truth is, we want partners who listen to us, who acknowledge that as men, they probably could never understand the kinds of struggles we endure as women. They could just never possibly know. Coming at it from that position of being like, I can't possibly know, but I will attempt to understand, is far better than saying, I presume to know better and I will advise you on how you should conduct yourself. We would be equally annoyed if like the men in our lives who we choose to date would be like, why can't you just be more like this or more assertive or do this or do, we'd get annoyed because we're like, well, we can't be you. We can't do what you do. And you need to understand, you need to have a realistic understanding of how the world operates, right? And so just assume that you don't know anything and approach it from a position of listening and understanding and learning, and be there for people and remind them. I have a lot of friends who've been through a lot of really abusive relationships because they come from very misogynistic, very patriarchal cultures that also kind of encourage them to stay trapped in these kinds of relationships. And I could be irritable with them and say, just dump the guy, he's stupid, you know what I mean? But they're not going to listen to me, because anybody who's been in that position will know that they can know something intellectually and feel very differently emotionally. And it's much harder to leave someone when you've made an emotional commitment to them or connection with them. And so, my approach with my friends who've been in this position has always been to remind them of how special they are, how important and how visionary and how kind and how gracious they are, and that they are deserving of better. And that's what FDS leaves people with, is the first time I've seen any kind of dating strategy or approach that encourages women to recognize that they are significant, important, that they have a right to have the kind of life that they want, that they're special, and that they actually deserve the good treatment that they think that they do. That it's not just a fantasy, it's not just a fairy tale. You deserve to have better. And so we need to approach that when we're understanding people who are coming from cultures that are way more misogynistic than we are, that the solutions that we have in our country sometimes just can't be relevant to them because they just don't have the same legal recourse or those the same kind of resources, you know? So you have to breathe life into them and tell them, hey, your country may not allow you to divorce easily or get these kinds of resources or do this kind of thing. But here's what you can do. And this is why I think you're important and significant. This is why I think that you are a good person. You deserve better. And they may still not change, right? We can only do the best that we can, and people still might not listen to us. But I think when you approach this with the level of sensitivity that it deserves and the compassion it deserves, we are going to move more minds and hearts with it instead of just going out of our way to be extremely aggressively, shoving our opinions and our feelings down somebody else's throat. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
That's so beautifully said. I really feel that compassion is the name of the game. And as you say, if we can change minds and hearts, that is how you move mountains. And so, again, never think that the work that we're doing here is forgettable or not noteworthy. This is life changing, world shaking kind of work we can do. And it starts with us. And with that, Diana, I feel like that's been our general overview of 4B. There's certainly much more that can be said and that I'm sure will be said in the future. But I think for our listeners at this point, what we'd ask is, what have you been seeing in your own region? What have you been hearing from distant shores? And how has that been altering your path forward in this fractured landscape of feminism and world politics?
Yep, we want to hear from everyone and we want to hear about your experiences. And, we want to have broader discussions about this because we're in a position where we can have these discussions. And we are one of the few podcasts, I think, that actually openly talk about these issues that are affecting the world. And so, yes, please do leave us feedback.
With that, I think we're going to wrap it up for this week's podcast. Please join us next week for another scintillating topic where Diana and I delve into the nuances and the hopes of strategies that will empower and enable us to create better futures for all.
Yep. And I hope all the ladies who are listening to this podcast have a wonderful week. And to all the scroats, die mad.
Women be liberated.